Caleb Morgan set down his hammer, looked at the woman he loved, and told her to go marry someone else. He said it quietly, steadily, like it didn't cost him everything just to get those words out. And Grace Whitaker stood there in that old barn, the summer heat pressing down on both of them, and didn't say a single word back. If you've ever loved someone and told yourself you weren't enough, this story is for you. Before we go any further, please subscribe to our channel. Drop the name of your city in the comments so we can see how far this story has traveled, and stay with us all the way to the end. You won't want to leave early. The summer of 1884 came down on Wyoming like punishment. That was the only word Caleb Morgan ever used for it, punishment. The kind of dry, merciless heat that didn't ask permission, didn't offer warning. Just arrived one morning and refused to leave. The creek on the south edge of his property had been running shallow since April. His cattle looked thinner than he liked. The north corner of his barn roof had been patched twice in the last year, and he could still see light coming through in the wrong places when the afternoon sun sat high enough. He was 35 years old and had nothing to show for it except worn boots, a piece of land that barely covered its own costs, and a stubborn streak that had kept him standing upright through things that would have put another man flat on his back. He told himself that stubbornness was enough. Most mornings he almost believed it. Grace Whitaker arrived at his barn just after 9 that Tuesday, the way she had 100 times before. She didn't knock. There was no reason to. She'd been walking in and out of this barn since they were neighbors barely old enough to understand what neighbors meant. She had a flour sack over one shoulder and moved like a woman who had work to do and no intention of wasting daylight doing anything else. "Got 2 extra sacks of oats from Heller's delivery," she said, setting one down near the gate. "Your mule needs them more than I do." Caleb looked up from the latch he'd been working on. "You didn't have to do that." "I know." She picked up the second sack and stacked it clean. "I did it anyway." That was Grace. She never made a gift feel like charity, never made help feel like pity. He respected that about her more than he knew how to say out loud. For a few minutes, they worked without talking. Caleb went back to the latch. Grace checked the water line on the far side of the stalls. The horses were calm. Outside, the heat pressed against the barn walls like it was trying to get in. Then Grace stopped moving. "Caleb?" Her voice had changed. Not softer exactly, but slower, deliberate. "You heard about the man coming in from Cheyenne?" He kept his eyes on the latch. "Heard some. Silas Beaumont." She said the name the way you say a word you're not sure yet belongs in your mouth. "He's a cattle investor. Thomas Aldridge at the feed store says he's got 4 properties, 2 of them running over 1,000 head each." "That's so." "He's coming to Ridge Creek at the end of the week." A pause. "Martha says he's coming specifically to meet me." Caleb's hands stopped moving, only for a second, then he started again. "Your friend Martha say anything that wasn't somebody else's business?" he asked. That made Grace almost smile. Almost, but the almost faded quick. "Do you think I should meet him?" she asked, and there it was. Plain and direct, the way Grace did everything. No games in it, no test hidden underneath. She was just asking him the way she'd asked him things her whole life. What he thought about the drought, what he thought about selling her east pasture, what he thought about the new minister's sermons. She asked because she trusted his answer. He turned toward her. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he's already accepted he can't keep. At her steady brown eyes, and the set of her jaw, and the way she carried herself even in a dusty barn on a hot summer morning, like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. He wanted to say no. The word was right there sitting in the center of his chest like a stone. "No, don't meet him. Don't let some polished man from Cheyenne come into this town and stand next to you and look good doing it. Don't you dare." What came out instead was something else entirely. "You deserve a rich man, Grace." He heard his own voice say it and hated himself for every syllable. Not a cowboy still trying to keep dust from swallowing his land. Grace went very still. The barn was quiet except for the sound of one of the horses shifting its weight and the distant call of a bird somewhere outside. She looked at him for a long moment, long enough, that he felt it move through him like cold water. Then she looked away, reached down, picked up an empty feed pail, and set it on the hook beside the gate. Calm, controlled. "All right," she said, just those 2 words. All right. She walked out of the barn without another sound, and Caleb stood there alone in the middle of all that heat and silence and felt the worst kind of fool. There is the kind who knew exactly what he was doing wrong and did it anyway. He told himself it was the right call. That night, sitting on his porch with a cup of coffee gone cold in his hand and the last of the daylight bleeding out over the ridge, he made himself believe it. Silas Beaumont could give Grace a house that didn't need patching, could give her cattle that didn't need watching through a drought, could give her a life that didn't hinge on whether the summer rains came early or late. What could Caleb give her? 7 years of showing up when things went wrong. A pair of hands that knew how to fix things, but couldn't seem to fix enough. A piece of land that broke even most years, and broke him in the years it didn't. That wasn't a life. That was barely surviving and calling it living. He went to bed early, lay in the dark, and told himself he'd done the right thing. Told himself Grace would understand someday. Maybe she already did. He didn't sleep much. By Wednesday, the town knew. That was how Ridge Creek worked. By the time Caleb rode in for supplies that morning, nods were being exchanged in doorways, and voices were dropping the minute he walked past. He bought his nails, and his oil, and his salt block, and did not look at anyone long enough to invite conversation. He was almost to his horse when Earl Prentice caught up to him outside the feed store. Earl was 60-something and had operated the same grain stall for 20 years. He was not a malicious man. He was just the kind of man who believed he was being helpful when he was being something else entirely. "Heard Silas Beaumont's arriving Friday," Earl said, falling into step beside Caleb. "Fine man. Good head for cattle. Word is he's looking to settle down. Maybe take on a good Wyoming spread." He glanced sideways. "Grace Whittaker'd do well by a man like that." Caleb loaded his sacks. "That's her business, Earl." "Sure is." Earl nodded, easy and agreeable. "Just saying it's good timing. Woman like her needs security, needs someone who can provide." Another sideways glance, this one longer. "Not that you haven't been a good neighbor to her all these years." Caleb swung up into his saddle. "Morning, Earl." He rode home and replaced the rotted plank in his west fence, and didn't think about Earl Prentice once. He thought about him approximately every 20 minutes for the rest of the day. Grace did not come to the barn on Thursday. That absence was louder than anything she could have said. In 7 years they had not gone more than 3 days without some kind of exchange. A borrowed tool, a shared water arrangement, a cup of coffee on one porch or the other. Grace not coming meant Grace had heard him, had taken what he said, and decided to hold it at face value. Part of him had hoped she wouldn't. He found himself working longer hours to fill the silence. Hauled water from the secondary creek before sunup. Rode the south pasture fence, looking for weak spots that mostly weren't there. Repaired the hinge on the equipment shed that had been working fine, but could afford to work better. He was elbow deep in the water trough repair. Friday morning, when he heard the sound of a horse he didn't recognize coming up the road. He straightened slowly, wiped his hands on his trousers. The rider who came through the front gate of his property was not someone he'd seen before, but he didn't need an introduction. The man sat his horse like someone who'd never had to wonder whether he could afford the horse. Clean jacket, despite the heat. Hat that had never seen serious weather. A face that was pleasant enough, not cruel, not arrogant on the surface, but arranged with the particular confidence of a man who had never once been told no by circumstance. Silas Beaumont stopped a few feet from where Caleb was standing and touched the brim of his hat. "Morning." His voice was smooth, practiced easy. "I'm looking for the Morgan property." "You found it," Caleb said. "Then you'd be Morgan." Not a question. Beaumont looked around the yard in a way that was careful enough to seem casual and practiced enough to be insulting. "Nice spread you've got here. Compact." Caleb said nothing. "I'm Silas Beaumont, up from Cheyenne. I've been looking at some properties in the area, and I understand you and Grace Whitaker have been neighbors." He let the words sit there, shaped just slightly wrong. "We are neighbors," Caleb said. "Her property lines up with mine on the east side." "Right." Beaumont nodded, like he was confirming something he'd already known. "She's a fine woman, very capable for someone working a place alone." Caleb looked at him, let the silence stretch out a beat longer than comfortable. "She is," he said finally, "one of the finest people I know." Beaumont smiled. It was a perfectly decent smile. That was somehow the most irritating thing about it. "I'd heard you two were close. I hope that doesn't make things awkward." "Why would it?" "Well," Beaumont tilted his head just slightly. "If a man's been carrying an interest in a woman for a long time, sometimes an outside arrival can feel like an interruption." Caleb pulled the rag off his shoulder and folded it slow. "If a man's carrying an interest in a woman, Mr. Beaumont, it's generally considered his responsibility to say so, not to wait around expecting others to hold off on his behalf." Something shifted in Beaumont's expression. Not much, just enough to show that the answer had surprised him. "Fair enough," he said. Then he touched his hat again and turned his horse back toward the road. "Morning to you, Morgan." Caleb watched him ride out. Stood there in the heat and silence and the smell of dust and creek water. Then he picked up his tools and went back to fixing the trough. Grace saw Silas Beaumont on Friday afternoon. Caleb knew because Martha Reed told him. Not directly, Martha wasn't wasteful enough to walk to his property just to update him, but she came to the feed store while he was there, and she said it loudly enough that it was clearly meant to travel. "Silas Beaumont is a perfectly polite man," Martha announced to no one in particular, because Martha said everything to no one in particular when she wanted it to reach someone specific. "Very polished, very generous. Asked Grace about her property like he was reading a catalog." The man at the counter, without looking up from his receipt, said, "That's so." Grace smiled at everything he said. Martha continued, "The way you smile at a doctor who's explaining something that doesn't concern you personally." Caleb paid for his coffee and left. That night, he sat with the account book open in front of him and ran numbers he had run 100 times already. Land value, cattle count, debt on the new pump, feed costs, expected yield if the summer came through decent. He knew every figure by heart, had memorized them the way men memorize the things that hurt them most. The numbers didn't change. He shut the book and went to stand at the window. Somewhere on the other side of the fence line, Grace Whitaker was in her house, probably sitting exactly the way she always sat at the end of a long day at the table, with both hands wrapped around a cup of something warm, thinking about whatever Grace thought about in her quiet hours. He had no idea what that was. In 7 years, he had never been brave enough to ask. He put his forehead against the cool window glass and thought, "This is what you chose. You chose this for her because you love her. That's the whole of it. It didn't feel like love. It felt like something being removed from a wound that wasn't quite ready to close." Saturday morning, Grace came to the barn. She came early before the full heat had arrived, when the air still held a little of the overnight cool. She didn't bring anything this time, just herself and the expression on her face that Caleb had never quite been able to read, the one that meant she had been thinking hard about something and had arrived at a conclusion she was going to share, whether he was ready to hear it or not. He was raking the center aisle when she walked in. She stopped in the middle of the floor. Let him look at her. "I want to ask you something," she said. "And I want a real answer, not the kind of answer you gave me Tuesday." Caleb kept the rake moving. "Tuesday I gave you the best answer I had." "You gave me the answer you thought protected me," she said. "That's different." He stopped raking. "I've been turning it over all week," Grace said. "Every morning and every night and every stretch of quiet in between. And I keep coming back to the same thing." Her voice stayed steady. That was what hurt most. She wasn't angry. She was just clear. You didn't tell me to consider Silas Beaumont because you thought he was right for me. You told me that because you decided you weren't. Caleb set the rake against the stall wall. He didn't have an answer ready. He hadn't been expecting her this morning, and he hadn't prepared one. Grace, don't. She said it gently. That was somehow worse. Don't do what you do where you start a sentence and then protect yourself inside it. Just tell me. Is that what happened? He looked at her for a long time. The barn was warm already, even in the early hour. The light came in low and gold through the gaps in the boards. His horses were settled. His tools were clean. His feed was stacked. He had built this small life with his hands piece by piece, and it had never felt small until this moment. Until he had to stand inside it and tell the truth. I know what I have, he said, and I know what that man can offer you. That's not what I asked. His jaw tightened. Grace. Caleb. She took one step toward him, just one. Her voice dropped just slightly. Is that what happened? You decided for me? The silence between them stretched out long and wide and honest. Yes, he said. Grace held his gaze. Something crossed her face, not satisfaction, not anger, something older, something closer to grief. Then we need to talk, she said, because you don't get to do that. She didn't say it loud. She didn't need to. Outside, a cloud moved over the sun, and the barn shifted from gold to shadow and back again. And Caleb Morgan, who had spent a week convincing himself he'd done the only right thing, looked at the woman standing 6 feet away from him and felt for the first time genuinely afraid not of losing her to Silas Beaumont, but of the real answer to a question he hadn't yet been willing to ask himself. Whether what he'd called humility had always been something else. She said it like a verdict. You don't get to do that. 6 words, and they landed in the center of Caleb's chest like a brand iron. He didn't move, didn't reach for the rake, didn't find something to fix with his hands the way he always did when a conversation got too close to the bone. He just stood there in his own barn, in his own life, and felt every corner of his careful reasoning come apart at the seam. I was trying to be honest with you, he said. No. Grace's voice didn't rise. That was the thing about her, she never needed volume to make a point land hard. You were trying to be honest about what you think you're worth. That's not the same thing. Grace, 7 years, Caleb? She said it straight and even. 7 years I have watched you work this land. I have stood beside you in drought. I helped you move cattle in the dark when you thought you were going to lose the whole South herd. I have drunk your coffee and eaten your bad biscuits, and never once, not once, thought to myself, this man is not enough. He looked away. She stepped forward. Look at me. He did. The only person in this county who thinks Caleb Morgan isn't enough, she said, is Caleb Morgan. The silence that followed was the loudest thing he'd heard in years. Louder than the storm that had taken his roof 2 winters back. Louder than the silence after his father died and left him this land and nothing else. He opened his mouth, closed it. I don't know what to say to that, he admitted. I'm not asking you to say anything yet, Grace said. I'm asking you to stop making decisions for me. That's all. Can you do that? He looked at her for a long, hard moment. Then he nodded once, slowly. She held his gaze another second, then turned and walked out of the barn. He stood there in the quiet she left behind and thought about the fact that she hadn't asked him if he loved her. She hadn't asked him to change his mind about Silas Beaumont. She hadn't asked for a promise or a declaration or anything dramatic at all. She had just asked him to stop shrinking himself on her behalf. And somehow, that was the hardest thing anyone had ever asked of him. He didn't see her again until Monday. In between he worked. That was what Caleb did with things he couldn't solve. With words he found something physical that needed doing, and he did it until his arms ached and his mind went quiet. He re-stretched the fence wire on the entire west border, cleaned and re-oiled every piece of tack in the barn, rebuilt the rotted section of the chicken coop that had been on his list for 3 months. He worked and he thought about what Grace had said and he came back to the same place every single time. She was right. He knew she was right. That was the part that made it so difficult to sit with. It wasn't a misunderstanding he could clarify or a mistake he could correct. It was a pattern, years-long, bone-deep of looking at himself and finding the number on the short side and deciding that settled things. His father had done the same. Worked himself raw on this land and never once let himself enjoy a single good year because the next bad one was always coming. Caleb had watched that all through boyhood and told himself he would be different. Would find a way to stand straighter inside his own life. Turns out, inheritance was a complicated thing. Monday morning, Martha Reed appeared at his gate on foot, which meant she had walked the half-mile from the main road specifically to get here and had no intention of making it seem casual. Caleb was splitting wood when he saw her coming. He set down the axe. "Martha, Caleb." She stopped at the fence post and folded her arms the way she always did when she had something to say and intended to say all of it. "I'm going to tell you something, and you're going to listen without interrupting. Can you manage that? Do I have a choice? Not a useful one." She unfolded one arm long enough to point at him. "Silas Beaumont had supper at Grace's table last night." The axe was still in his hand. He set it carefully against the fence post. "She invited him?" he asked. His voice came out flatter than he meant it to. He was invited by her aunt who arrived from Laramie on Sunday and decided within approximately 4 hours of arriving that Silas Beaumont was the answer to every question Grace had ever had. Martha's mouth drew into a thin line. Grace's aunt is a well-meaning woman with the romantic instincts of a cattle auctioneer. Despite everything, Caleb almost made a sound that was close to a laugh. "How'd the supper go?" Beaumont was charming, told stories about his properties, his investment plans, his vision for the future of Wyoming cattle. Martha paused. Grace smiled politely and refilled his coffee twice and said approximately nothing of substance all evening. Caleb studied her face. "Why are you telling me this?" Martha looked at him the way a woman looks at a slow student she has already explained the lesson to 3 times. "Because you are the only person in a 50-mile radius who needs to be told that Grace Whitaker refilling a man's coffee and saying nothing is not a woman warming up to him. It is a woman waiting for the evening to end." Something shifted in his chest. He didn't let it move too far. "She's allowed to make her own choices," he said. Careful, deliberate. "She is," Martha agreed. "But a choice requires options. And right now the only option she's being presented with is a polished man from Cheyenne who can recite his acreage from memory." She let that sit for a second. The other option apparently decided to take himself out of the running before anyone asked him to. Caleb looked at the wood grain on the fence post. "Martha, I'm not here to push you," she said, and her voice was quieter now. Almost kind. "I'm here because Grace is my closest friend, and I have watched her make herself smaller around this situation, and that is not a thing she does. Grace Whitaker does not make herself small, and the fact that she's doing it now tells me she's trying not to want something she's already decided she can't have." He didn't answer. Martha unfolded both arms and straightened up. "A man can be poor in money and rich in loyalty. Most women over 40 know the difference. Your Grace figured it out a long time before that." She turned to go. "Don't let her sit at another man's supper table waiting for you to figure out what she already knows." She walked back toward the road without looking back. Caleb stood there until she was out of sight. Then he picked up the axe, set a new log, and split it clean down the center with one stroke. He rode to town Tuesday afternoon for a reason he told himself was practical. He needed to settle an account at the hardware store and pick up a part for the water pump. Both things were true. Neither of those was why he went. He saw Grace at the dry goods store. She was standing at the counter looking at fabric samples, and she was not alone. Her Aunt Helen was beside her, a compact woman with sharp eyes and the particular energy of someone who considered themselves a problem solver in situations that weren't problems. And on Grace's other side, examining a bolt of dark wool with the air of a man who had never personally needed to care about the price of fabric, was Silas Beaumont. Caleb stopped in the doorway. Beaumont was saying something. Grace was nodding. Her aunt was smiling with the fierce brightness of a woman watching a plan come together. Then Grace looked up. Their eyes met across the store. Just for a second. Just long enough. She didn't look away first. Neither did he. Then Aunt Helen said something and touched Grace's arm, and Grace looked back down at the fabric, and Beaumont was still talking, and Caleb turned and walked to the hardware store and paid his account and picked up his pump part and rode home. He unsaddled his horse, put away his tools, ate a dinner he didn't taste. Then he sat on the porch in the dark and admitted to himself quietly and without drama that he was losing her. Not because Beaumont was winning, but because he, Caleb Morgan, had handed her over with both hands and was now watching it happen from a careful, cowardly distance and calling it respect. It wasn't respect. He knew what it was. It was fear dressed up in the language of selflessness. It was a man too afraid of being told he wasn't enough by someone who mattered, so he'd gone ahead and said it first to himself where it was safe. His father's voice in his head. Don't reach for what you can't hold. His own voice quieter. What if you're wrong about what you can hold? He sat there until the stars were full out and the coyotes started their nightly argument somewhere to the south. Then he went inside and lay down and stared at the ceiling and made himself answer the question he'd been avoiding for 7 years. Did he love Grace Whitaker? Yes, completely, without reservation or revision or the ability to imagine his life organized differently. Had he loved her for a long time, since the winter of 1879 when she'd come over in a sleet storm because his horse had thrown a shoe, and she'd been afraid the cold would get the animal before morning. She'd stayed 3 hours matter-of-fact and capable and entirely unconcerned with how the situation looked to anyone passing by. He'd watched her hands working and thought, that's a person I want in my life. And then he'd spent 5 years convincing himself he'd meant it in the neighborly sense. Was he going to do anything about it? He lay in the dark for a long time with that question. Wednesday started sharp. Caleb was at the south fence before sunrise checking the water line when he heard riders on the main road. He looked up. 4 horses. Beaumont in front, 2 hired hands behind him, and this was the part that hit him square. Grace's ranch foreman, old Pete Henley, riding alongside. Beaumont had apparently already been out to Grace's property this morning, early, before the heat. Pete caught Caleb's eye as they passed and gave him a look that was entirely unreadable, except for the slight tightening around the edges that meant Pete was doing his job and not commenting on the situation. Caleb watched them go. Then he went back to checking the water line and counted every reason. This was fine, normal, none of his business, and entirely within Grace's right. He got to 11 reasons before he stopped counting and stood up and said out loud to no one but the Wyoming morning, "This is not fine." His horse flicked an ear at him. "Don't look at me like that," Caleb told the horse. He rode back to the barn, spent 20 minutes doing nothing useful, tried to eat something, gave up, went out and started repairing the chicken coop extension he'd been putting off. He was halfway through it when he heard Grace's voice. She was coming around the corner of the barn at a walk hands-free, and she was alone. No aunt, no Beaumont, just Grace with the particular expression she got when she'd made a decision and was coming to say so. Caleb straightened up slowly. He did not reach for a tool. He did not give himself something to hold. "I heard Beaumont was out your way this morning," he said. He was. Grace stopped 10 feet away. He made an offer. Something cold moved through him. "On your property. On my property." Her voice was even, measured, giving nothing away. "He wants to combine our eastern grazing sections under a joint management agreement. He called it a business proposition. My aunt called it inspired." Caleb looked at her steadily. "What did you call it?" "I called it something I needed to think about." She paused. "But that's not why I'm here." "Why are you here?" She crossed her arms, not defensively, more like she was organizing herself. I want you to tell me something, and this time I want the real answer. Not the answer you gave me last Tuesday. Not the careful answer. The true one. All right, he said. Quiet. If I walked away from Silas Beaumont's offer, she said, and the business proposition, and the bigger house, and all of it walked away from every comfortable thing he could offer me, and nothing came of it. If I just walked away and kept running my place alone, and nothing changed between us. Her eyes were direct, steady as the earth under them. Would you regret that I'd done it? The question was so precise it almost took his breath. He thought about giving her a careful answer. He thought about the 10 reasonable things he could say that would protect both of them from the next part of this conversation. Then he thought about sitting on his porch in the dark last night, looking at the stars, and the question he'd finally made himself answer. Yes, he said. I'd regret it every day. Grace went very still. Because you'd feel guilty, she asked. No. He looked at her steadily. Because it would mean I'd let you sacrifice something real for a situation I never had the courage to be honest about. She held his gaze. He didn't look away this time. Didn't reach for the hammer or the fence post or any of the 100 physical things he usually put between himself and a moment this direct. Then why, she said slowly, have you spent the better part of 2 weeks telling me to go toward that man? He breathed out. Long and slow. Because I look at this place, he said, and I see what it is. And I look at what that man is offering, and I see what that is. And when I put those two things next to each other, you pick the one that isn't you, she finished. He didn't deny it. Caleb. She stepped forward. 1 step. Her voice dropped not softer exactly, but closer, more direct. I have been running a ranch alone since I was 24 years old. I have buried 2 horses, outlasted, a drought fixed my own roof, and told 3 different well-meaning men that I didn't want what they were offering. She stopped. Do you think for 1 minute that I don't know my own mind? I never thought that. Then trust it. She held his gaze long enough for it to mean something. I know what a good man looks like. I know what loyalty looks like. I know what showing up looks like because you have done it so many times, I have stopped counting. Her voice was steady, but there was something underneath it now that wasn't quite steady, and that was the part that reached him deepest. What I don't know is why the man who has been all of those things won't let himself be seen as them. Caleb was quiet for the long moment. When he spoke, it came out rough around the edges. My father told me once that wanting things above your station was the fastest road to misery. Your father, Grace said carefully, was a man who worked himself to nothing, protecting himself from a life he never let himself want. Caleb's jaw tightened. I'm not saying it to be cruel, she added quieter. I'm saying it because I watched him do it too. And I see the same thing in you, and it scares me, Caleb. Not because I don't think you're capable, because I think you're capable of doing the same thing he did, and calling it good sense. The barn was very quiet. Outside, the day was fully hot now, the summer bearing down the way it had been doing for weeks. Somewhere, one of his cattle lowed long and low. What do you want me to say, Grace? He asked. I don't want you to say anything yet, she said. I want you to think about one thing. She turned slightly toward the barn door. When you told me to go meet Silas Beaumont, what were you protecting me? She glanced back at him over her shoulder. Or yourself. She left, and Caleb stood in the silence she left behind in the heat of that Wyoming summer, with that question settling over him like dust after a long ride. He had an answer. He'd had it for a long time. He just hadn't been ready to say it out loud yet. That evening, Martha Reed found him at the water pump, the one that had finally given out, entirely crouching in the dirt, trying to sort out whether the part he'd bought would be enough to fix it, or whether it was past fixing. Martha sat herself on the fence rail nearby without being asked. Grace turned down the business proposition, she said. Caleb looked up. When? This afternoon. Told Silas Beaumont she appreciated his interest, but she preferred to keep her property management decisions independent. Martha paused. Her aunt cried. Beaumont was gracious about it, which somehow made the whole thing worse. Caleb looked back at the pump. "She tell you why she turned it down?" he asked. "She told me," Martha said, "that she wasn't interested in a partnership with someone she couldn't trust to know the difference between a business arrangement and a courtship." He set down the wrench. "And Beaumont?" he asked. "Still in town through Friday," Martha said. "Still very polished, still very gracious." She looked at Caleb with the particular patience of a woman who had been watching two stubborn people circle each other for years. And still not the person Grace Whittaker walked half a mile in the heat to have a conversation with yesterday morning. Caleb was quiet. "You asked me once," Martha said, "how a man knows when he's being a fool." "I don't remember asking you that. You were 28, and you'd just turned down a piece of good land because you thought you couldn't manage it." She raised her eyebrows. "You absolutely asked me that." He almost smiled. "What did you say?" "I said a fool is just a man who knows the right answer and keeps picking the wrong one because the right one scares him." She hopped down from the fence rail. Still true. She began walking back toward the road. "Fix your pump, Caleb. And then maybe think about what else needs fixing before it's past it." He watched her go. Then he picked up the wrench and looked at the pump and looked at the part in his other hand, and very quietly came to the conclusion that Martha had been right. Some things left too long got past fixing. He was not going to let that be the thing that mattered most. He worked on the pump until the light was fully gone and the stars came out and the night air cooled enough to breathe properly. And when he finally got the part seated right and the water ran clean and steady, he stood up and wiped his hands and felt something settle in him that had been unsettled for 2 weeks. He knew what he had. He knew what it was worth. He had always known. Tomorrow, he was going to stop letting fear do his talking. He woke up Thursday with the kind of clarity that only comes after a man has finally stopped arguing with himself. Not peace exactly. Something sharper than peace. The kind of feeling that sits in your sternum and doesn't move the feeling of a decision that's already been made and is just waiting for the rest of you to catch up. He fed the horses, checked the water line running clean and steady same as last night. Drank his coffee standing at the window, the way he always did, except this morning he didn't stare at the account book. He didn't run numbers. He didn't calculate what he had against what he lacked. He thought about what he was going to say to Grace Whittaker. He'd been thinking about it since he fixed the pump, turning the words over, testing them, discarding the ones that sounded rehearsed. Grace would hear rehearsed from 50 feet. She always did. She had a particular way of going quiet when she thought someone was saying words instead of meaning. And the last thing Caleb wanted today was Grace going quiet on him. He needed real. He could do real. He was still working out the shape of it when he heard a horse coming hard up the road. Not a casual rider. Someone moving with urgency. He set down his coffee and stepped outside. It was Pete Henley, Grace's foreman, white-haired and leathery, a man who did not hurry unless there was actual cause. He was hurrying now. He pulled up at Caleb's gate and leaned forward in the saddle. "Caleb?" Pete's voice was tight. "Need you to ride over." "What happened?" Grace's east fence line came down in the night. 3 posts pulled clean, something got into the wire. She's got cattle in the Aldridge pasture, and Aldridge's men already found them. Pete's jaw worked. "Aldridge is riding out this morning. He's not pleased." Caleb was already moving toward the barn. "How many head?" 11, maybe 12. "Beaumont with her." Pete paused just a half second. "He arrived at her property about 20 minutes ago. Rode over as soon as word got around town. Caleb saddled his horse in 4 minutes flat. Rode out without another word. He knew what 11 head in the wrong pasture meant. He knew what Thomas Aldridge meant, a man with sharp property instincts and a short temper for what he called careless neighboring. And he knew without having to think about it that Grace facing Aldridge with Silas Beaumont standing beside her, offering help, was the exact kind of situation that could tip in a direction none of them would be able to undo cleanly. He rode hard. He heard the voices before he reached the fence line. Aldridge's was the loudest, not yelling, but the particular carrying tone of a man who has decided he's been wronged and wants witnesses to know it. 11 head Miss Whitaker, in my east pasture. My men found them at first light. Aldridge was a big man, red-faced in any weather, and currently standing with his hands on his belt in the posture of someone about to make a point that cost other people money. Now I understand accidents happen. I understand fence lines fail. But this is the third time in 2 years that something from your property has ended up on mine. Grace was standing straight, arms at her sides. Her voice when she answered was controlled in the way that meant she was working to keep it that way. The fence was intact when I checked it yesterday, Thomas. Whatever pulled those posts did it in the night. That may well be, Aldridge said. That doesn't change the situation. I'll have my cattle back by noon, Grace said. I'll repair the line today. You'll repair the line, Aldridge repeated, and his tone shifted into something less agreeable. That's good. And the grazing damage, 3 acres of my east pasture those animals were through. I'll compensate you for the grazing damage, Grace said. With what? Aldridge asked, not cruelly, but bluntly. Miss Whitaker, I know your situation. I know your last quarter was tight. I know your well repair cost you. Thomas. That was Beaumont, smooth and measured, stepping in from the side. I think we can come to a reasonable arrangement here. I'd be glad to. No. Grace's voice cut across Beaumont's so cleanly that he actually stopped mid-sentence. Thank you, Mr. Beaumont. This is my property and my responsibility. Beaumont took a step back. Aldridge looked briefly surprised. Then he went back to looking aggrieved. It was the moment Caleb arrived. He came through the broken fence line on horseback, stopped, swung down, and walked to where Grace was standing. He didn't look at Beaumont. He looked at Aldridge. Thomas, he said. Even. Steady. Aldridge turned. Morgan? I've got 4 hands and a spare reel of wire, Caleb said. Line'll be fixed by noon, and the grazing damage I'll split it with Miss Whitaker. Grace turned to look at him. He felt it but didn't look back yet. This part needed to get settled first. Half the compensation from me, half from the ranch account. Caleb continued. We'll have your cattle cut out and back on her land inside the hour. That work for you? Aldridge studied him for a moment. Something shifted in the man's face. Not warmth exactly, but recognition. The recognition of a man who understood straight dealing when he heard it. Your wire, your hands, Aldridge said. My wire, my hands, Caleb confirmed. Her fence, but neighbors fix fences together out here. Aldridge nodded once slow. All right, noon on the repair, and I want the compensation figure settled before end of week. He looked at Grace. Miss Whitaker. Then at Caleb. Morgan. He walked back to his horse and rode toward his own property without another word. The silence he left behind was considerable. Beaumont broke it first. That was well handled, he said, and he sounded like he meant it, which was almost worse than if he'd sounded put out. He looked at Caleb with an expression that was polite and measuring in equal parts. You're a good neighbor, Morgan. Try to be, Caleb said. Beaumont glanced at Grace. Something passed across his face, a man reading a room and finding the information inconvenient. I'll leave you both to sort the morning out, he said finally. He touched his hat to Grace, Miss Whitaker, and to Caleb with a nod that was precisely calibrated. Morgan. He rode back toward the road, and then it was just Caleb and Grace and the broken fence posts and the sound of cattle somewhere in the wrong pasture. Grace looked at him. You didn't have to do that, she said. I know. I had it handled. I know that too. He met her eyes. I wanted to help. That's different from thinking you needed saving. She held his gaze for a moment. Then something in her face shifted, not quite softened, but opened. The way a door opens that's been shut a long time. Not dramatically, just open. Your wire and your hands, she said quietly. Yes, ma'am. And you'll split the compensation figure. Yes, ma'am. She was quiet for one breath. 2. Why? He looked at her steadily. Because that's what you do for someone you... He stopped. Adjusted. Because that's what neighbors do for each other when things go wrong. Grace looked at him for a long moment, long enough that he wondered if she was going to call him on the adjusted sentence. She was sharp enough to have caught it. "All right," she said. "Let's go get my cattle back." They worked through the morning side by side, Caleb's hands cutting the cattle out of Aldridge's pasture, Pete restringing wire on the fence line, Grace directing it all with the competent, no-wasted motion efficiency that Caleb had always admired in her. She never stood and watched when she could be doing. Never issued instructions she wasn't willing to carry out herself. Beaumont did not come back. By 11:30 the cattle were in the right pasture, the fence was strung clean, and the posts were solid enough to hold through the end of summer. Caleb's men rode back toward his property. Pete went to check the water troughs, and Caleb found himself standing 20 feet from Grace, both of them tired and dusty, the morning's emergency resolved. "Coffee," Grace said. "Sure," he said. They walked to her house. It was the first time in 2 weeks he'd been inside her kitchen. It felt different now, not the place itself, but the air in it. Something between them had shifted in the last few hours, and they both knew it, and neither of them had said so yet. Grace put the pot on. Caleb leaned against the counter and watched her move around the kitchen the same way he'd watched her move around his barn 100 times. Efficient, unhurried, entirely herself. "He's leaving Friday," Grace said her back to him. "Beaumont?" "Yes." She turned and leaned against the opposite counter, arms folded loosely. "He told me this morning before the fence situation. He said he appreciated my hospitality, and he thought I was a woman of remarkable capability." She paused. "He said he hoped I'd reconsider his business proposition in the future. Will you?" "No. Simple. Clean. No drama in it." Caleb nodded. "He's not a bad man," Grace said. "I want to be fair about that. He came in here meaning to do right by somebody, and he was perfectly decent about the whole thing." "He was," Caleb agreed. "But he looked at this place the way you look at a problem to solve," she said. "He looked at me the way you look at an asset with good fundamentals." She met Caleb's eyes. "And I've been looked at a certain way for long enough that I know the difference." Caleb didn't say anything. He waited. "I know what I want," Grace said. Quiet, direct. "I've known it for a while." Grace said, "Let me finish." She unfolded her arms. "I am not going to stand here and tell you how I feel and then wait for you to decide if that's convenient. That's not a conversation I'm willing to have." She held his gaze. "What I am going to do is tell you that I will not wait indefinitely. I am 31 years old. I have a ranch to run and a life to live, and I am not going to spend the next 5 years hoping you decide you're worth loving." It landed like a hand flat on a table. No anger. No ultimatum dressed up as something softer. Just the plain, exact truth of where she stood. Caleb set down his coffee cup, straightened up. "Grace," he said, "I have been a coward." She blinked. He kept going. "Not about the ranch, not about the land or the money or any of the practical things. I can work with practical things." He moved toward her. 1 step, 2. Stopped close enough that there was no version of this that was still casual. "I have been a coward about you. About saying out loud what has been true for years because I was more afraid of being wrong than I was willing to be honest." She looked up at him. Her arms stayed at her sides. "I love you," he said. First time he'd ever put those 3 words in that order in front of another human being in his adult life. "I have loved you since that sleet storm in '79 when you came over in the dark because you were worried about my horse. And I have spent a long time since then talking myself into why that wasn't something I should act on." His voice was rough but steady. "I am done talking myself into that." Grace was very still. "I am not a rich man," he said. "I don't know that I ever will be. This land is good, but it's hard. Some years it gives. Some years it just takes. I cannot promise you a big house or 1,000 head or a future without difficulty." He held her gaze. What I can promise you is that I will show up. Every time life gets hard, I will be standing next to you when it does. I have been doing that informally for 7 years. I would like to do it with your permission." Grace held his gaze for a long, long moment. Then she said, "You really did love me since that sleet storm." He almost laughed. The tension in his chest broke sideways and became something much warmer. "Yes. You are an extremely slow-moving man, Caleb Morgan. I am aware of that. That was 6 years ago." "I know what year it was, Grace." She looked at him. And then, quiet, deliberate entirely on her own terms, she crossed the 2 feet of kitchen between them and took his face in both her hands and kissed him. It was brief, just a moment. But it was so entirely Grace, direct and sure, and without a single wasted motion, that he stood there afterward, feeling like the floor had shifted slightly under him. "You are not allowed," she said, pulling back just enough to look at him clearly, "to take another 6 years about anything. Are we agreed?" "Completely agreed," he said. She dropped her hands but didn't step back. Neither did he. "I have conditions," she said. "Tell me." "You stop measuring yourself against every man in the county with more land than you. That's a reasonable condition. And you stop making decisions on my behalf because you think you're protecting me. Also reasonable. And when things get hard," she looked at him directly, "and they will get hard, Caleb, because that's what ranching is. You talk to me instead of going quiet and working yourself into the ground alone." He looked at her for a moment. That one was harder. Not the promise itself, the promise was easy. It was recognizing how many times he'd done exactly what she'd described and how long it had taken her to finally say it out loud. "Yes," he said. "I can do that." Grace nodded once like a deal being settled. Then she turned and picked up both coffee cups from the counter and handed him one. "Good," she said. "Then drink your coffee. We've got a compensation figure to settle with Thomas Aldridge before end of week, and I need to look at the East Fence Post records." Caleb took the cup, and he stood in Grace Whitaker's kitchen in the heat of that Wyoming summer coffee in hand, and something permanently unlocked in his chest, and thought this is what it was supposed to feel like all along. It was Martha Reed who found out first, because Martha Reed always found out first, and she appeared at Grace's gate the following morning with the expression of a woman who had won a very long argument with the universe. She did not say "I told you so." She was better than that. She said, "About time," looked at them both with the particular satisfaction of someone watching a long overdue storm finally break, and asked if there was coffee. There was. The 3 of them sat on Grace's porch in the morning heat, and Martha told them about Silas Beaumont's departure, which she had apparently personally witnessed from the general store window. He had ridden out just after sunrise, polished and gracious to the last, tipping his hat to 3 separate people on the main road. "Nice man," Martha said. "Wrong story." "Martha," Grace said. "I'm being complimentary," Martha said. Caleb drank his coffee and said nothing, and felt the particular satisfaction of a man who has just been through something that hurt and come out the other side of it into something better. Tell you. That afternoon, word got around town. It always did in Ridge Creek. By the time Caleb rode in to settle the compensation figure with Thomas Aldridge, he was aware of 3 separate conversations that stopped when he walked past and resumed in lowered voices when he didn't stop. Earl Prentice caught him outside the feed store again. "Heard Beaumont rode out," Earl said. "Did hear that," Caleb agreed. "Heard some other things too," Earl said with the tone of a man triangulating toward something. "About you and the Whitaker place." Caleb looked at him pleasantly. "That's so." "That's so." Earl studied him. "You doing all right, Caleb?" Caleb thought about the question. Thought about Grace's kitchen and the coffee and the list of conditions delivered in that clear, direct voice. Thought about the 6 years he'd spent talking himself into smaller spaces than he needed. "Yeah, Earl," he said. "I'm doing real well." He went and settled the figure with Aldridge, who was gruff but fair about it, and he rode home in the full heat of the afternoon and felt every mile of it, the sun on his back, the good tiredness in his legs, the clean air coming off the ridge. He fed the horses, walked the south fence, checked the water line still running clean. Then he stood outside his barn and looked at his property the way he hadn't let himself look at it in years. Not through the lens of what was missing, not against the standard of what Silas Beaumont had, or Earl Prentice thought, or the town expected. Just the land itself, his fence lines, his cattle thin but his barn with the patched roof and the good dry floor and the horses that knew his voice, his life. It wasn't a wealthy life. It was never going to be that. But it was solid. It was built with his hands and his years and his willingness to stay when staying was hard. And it was he turned this thought over carefully like something new enough, not in spite of what it lacked, just enough on its own terms for what it was. He didn't know how long he'd stood there when he heard footsteps. He didn't need to turn to know who they were. Grace came and stood beside him, not touching, just there. They looked at the land in the late afternoon quiet. "You're not counting anymore," she said. It wasn't a question. "Trying not to," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "It's a good piece of land, Caleb." "It is," he said, and meant it, completely and without the usual shadow behind it. Then the wind shifted off the ridge, and somewhere to the north, the first real sound of the summer storm that had been building all week rolled through the sky low and long. Not close yet, but coming. Grace looked up. He followed her gaze. "Storm's coming," she said. "Always does," he said. And neither of them moved, because for the first time in a long time, neither of them was afraid of it. The storm hit that night. Not the slow grumbling kind that builds for days and then disappoints. This one arrived the way real Wyoming storms do, fast and certain, and with no interest in what you'd planned. By 9 o'clock, the wind was pulling hard at anything not tied down, and by 10, the rain was coming in sheets, the kind that found every gap you thought you'd sealed. Caleb was in the barn at midnight, lantern in hand, checking the patched roof section he'd never quite trusted. It was holding. Barely, but holding. He pressed his palm flat against the board where the patch met the old timber and felt no give, and told himself that was good enough for tonight. He was wrong about that. 20 minutes later, the northeast corner let go. Not the whole section, just a 3-foot gap where the patch had lifted at the edge, and the wind had gotten underneath and done what wind does when you give it an opening. Water came in hard and fast, straight down onto the stored feed he'd stacked against that wall 3 weeks ago. Caleb moved before he'd finished thinking. Feed sacks first, he dragged them away from the water and stacked them center barn, 200 pounds of oats and barley that he could not afford to lose to wet rot. Then the tack. Then the tools. He worked in the lantern light with the rain hammering the roof above him and the wind making the barn walls shudder on the long gusts, and he did not stop moving until everything that could be ruined was somewhere it couldn't be. Then he climbed up into the loft and got the repair done. The only way you get things done in the middle of a storm badly, with whatever's available, and with the intention of doing it properly in the morning. By the time he climbed down, he was soaked through his shoulder ached, where he'd wrenched it, getting the board flat, and it was past 1 in the morning. He stood in the center of his barn, in the wet and the dark, and took stock. Feed saved. Tack dry. Horses settled unspooked, accustomed to his voice. Roof temporarily solved. Damage total. 1 ruined patch, 1 wrenched shoulder, and approximately 4 hours of sleep he was not going to get. He picked up the lantern, and then he heard hoofbeats. Coming through the storm. Fast at first, then slowing. Then Grace Whitaker's voice outside the barn door, louder than the rain. "Caleb, you in there?" He crossed the barn in 4 strides and pulled the door open. She was on horseback, rain-soaked, her hat doing almost nothing against the weather. She had a coil of rope over one shoulder and what looked like a canvas patch kit in her other hand. He stared at her. "Grace, what in the—" "I saw your lantern from my place," she said, moving fast, back and forth. She swung down without waiting to be invited. "That's not a man checking on horses. That's a man dealing with a problem." She stepped past him into the barn, looked at the center-piled feed sacks, looked at the wet floor under the northeast wall, looked up at the loft. Roof. Northeast corner, he said. It's patched for tonight. How bad? Bad enough that I'll be up there at first light. He paused. You rode out in this because you saw my lantern moving. Yes? Grace. You said you'd talk to me instead of going quiet and working alone. She turned and looked at him directly, rain still dripping from the brim of her hat. Your lantern at 1 a.m. in a storm is not talking to me, but I decided to come talk to you instead. She held up the canvas patch kit. I've got better material than whatever you used. He looked at her for a long moment. This woman, this specific, remarkable, entirely impossible woman had ridden through a Wyoming storm in the middle of the night because his lantern was moving wrong. You're soaked, he said. I'm aware. You could have waited till morning. I could have, she agreed. But you'd have been up here alone in the rain doing a bad patch job on a barn that deserves a good one. She walked toward the loft ladder without another word. He followed her up. They worked side by side in the lantern light while the storm pressed against the roof from outside. Grace knew what she was doing. Her repair work was cleaner than his, her hands faster on the canvas ties. He held the material flat while she secured the edges, and twice she told him to move his hand 2 inches left, and both times she was right. By 2:30 the patch was solid. Not permanent, but solid. They climbed down and stood in the barn and listened to the rain. It was already softening. The worst of the storm was moving past. Thank you, Caleb said. You're welcome. Grace sat down on a feed sack that was considerably drier than she was. Sit down, Caleb. You're listing to the left. I'm not listing. Your shoulder, she said. You wrenched it. I could see it in the loft. She pointed at the sack beside her. He sat. She reached over without ceremony and pressed 2 fingers along the top of his shoulder, finding the joint, testing the angle. He held still. Her hands were sure and clinical about it the way she was sure and clinical about most physical things, no performance in it. Just getting information she needed. Not torn, she said. Pulled. You'll be sore for 3 days. She took her hands away. Don't do overhead work tomorrow. I have overhead work to do tomorrow, the roof. Pete and I will come over in the morning. She looked at him. That is what I mean about not doing things alone. He looked at her. She looked back. Outside the rain softened further to a steady drum. I'm still getting used to it, he said. And he meant more than just asking for help with roof repairs. She knew it. He could tell she knew it by the way she nodded, not sharp or satisfied, but patient. I know, she said. That's all right. I'm not asking you to change overnight. She turned the canvas patch roll over in her hands. I'm just asking you to try. I'm trying, he said. I know that too. They sat there in the 2:30 quiet of the barn while the storm moved off to the east and the horses breathed and settled, and it was he searched for the right word and landed on it easy. Not without weight, not without all the things still ahead of them, the practical difficulties and the hard seasons and the work that never fully ended. But easy between them. Easy in the way that only happens between 2 people who have finally stopped performing and started just being present. Grace, he said. I want to do this right. She turned to look at him. Something in her face was careful and open at the same time. What does right look like to you? She asked. I want to court you properly, he said. Whatever that means now after all this. I know we've skipped over some of the ordinary steps. He held her gaze. But I don't want to just fall into something because the storm broke at the right time and Beaumont left and the situation resolved. I want to do it properly. Grace studied him for a moment. Caleb Morgan, she said slowly. Are you asking to court me? Yes, ma'am. I am. She looked at him for another long moment. Then she stood up, took her canvas patch roll under her arm, and walked toward the barn door. He watched her go. His chest tightened. She stopped at the door, looked back over her shoulder. Sunday, she said. Come to dinner. Bring something useful, not something impressive. And don't be late." She pushed the door open. "That's courting. We'll start there." She walked out into the easing rain. Caleb sat on the feed sack in his barn at 2:30 in the morning. Shoulder-aching roof patched everything in its place, and felt the particular, uncomplicated happiness of a man who has just been told exactly where to show up and when. Sunday came in clear and dry, the storm a memory. The sky the particular deep blue that follows bad weather in Wyoming like an apology. He brought cornbread. Not the impressive kind. The plain, honest kind he'd been making since he was 16. Slightly heavy on the bottom, slightly too brown on the edges, exactly right in the middle. He wrapped it in cloth and rode to her property and arrived 7 minutes early, which he spent sitting on his horse at her gate, counting fence posts until it was close enough to the hour to knock. She opened the door and looked at the wrapped cornbread. "Good," she said. "Come in." It was that simple. They ate at her kitchen table roast chicken, summer beans, cornbread that she complimented once and did not oversell. They talked the way they'd always talked about practical things, mostly the fence line and the water situation, and what Earl Prentice had said at the feed store that week. But underneath the practical things, there was something different now. A current. A warmth that hadn't been allowed to sit at the table before. After dinner, they sat on her porch. The evening came in quiet. "My aunt wrote," Grace said. "From Laramie." "What did she say?" "She said I was a stubborn woman with romantic notions that would keep me poor." Grace looked at the horizon. "She also said in the next paragraph that she hoped I was happy." "Are you happy?" Caleb asked. Grace turned and looked at him. "Ask me in a year," she said. "But right now, tonight, sitting here?" She paused. "Yes." He nodded. Let that settle over him. "My father would have thought I was making a mistake," he said quietly. "Not as a warning, not to reopen old wounds, just honestly." "I know," Grace said. "What do you think?" He thought about 7 years of showing up. About fence lines repaired and water shared and cattle moved in the dark. About the account book and the numbers that never quite balanced, and the roof that kept needing fixing, and the way none of that had ever once made him want to be somewhere else. "I think," he said slowly, "that my father was a man who protected himself from wanting things. And I spent a long time thinking that was wisdom." He looked at her. "I don't think it was wisdom. I think it was loneliness that learned to call itself common sense." Grace was quiet. "That's the most honest thing you've ever said to me," she said finally. "I'm working on saying more of them." She reached over and set her hand on top of his. Just rested it there. Not dramatic. Not a moment designed to be remembered. Just her hand on his, on her porch, in the quiet evening. He turned his hand over and held hers. The weeks that followed were not a love story in the showy sense. They were two ranchers in the hard middle of a Wyoming summer working their separate properties, borrowing tools and sharing water arrangements, and sometimes riding a fence line together because 2 pairs of eyes were better than one. Caleb came to Sunday dinner every week without being asked more than once. Grace appeared at his barn on Wednesday mornings with a frequency that became its own kind of arrangement. The town noticed. Of course it did. Ridge Creek noticed everything, discussed it thoroughly, and eventually either approved or disapproved, and then noticed something else. Earl Prentice told Caleb he was a fortunate man. Caleb agreed. Thomas Aldridge, who was not a sentimental person, told Grace at the dry goods store that Morgan was solid and she could do worse, and several people had done exactly that. Grace thanked him politely and did not point out that she hadn't asked. Martha Reed said nothing publicly, which was the loudest endorsement she was capable of giving. It was the second Sunday in August when things shifted again. Caleb arrived at Grace's for dinner and found her at the kitchen table with papers spread in front of her, and her face had the particular set it got when she was working through a problem she hadn't solved yet. "Everything all right?" he asked. "Sit down," she said. He sat. She turned one of the papers toward him. It was a water rights document. Old. The ink was faded at the edges, and the legal language was dense, but Caleb had dealt with enough property documents to read the shape of it fast. "Where did this come from?" he asked. "My father's files," Grace said. "I was going through the back cabinet looking for the deed copy, and I found a whole folder I'd never opened." She pressed her finger to a line near the bottom. "Read that." He read it. Then he read it again. The document was a water rights agreement from 1871, predating both of their property's current deeds. It outlined an original claim on the primary creek running along the property boundary between what was now his land and hers. The claim was in her father's name. But the language, and this was where his stomach tightened, the language described the full creek volume through August, which meant if the document was valid and standing, it superseded the informal water-sharing arrangement they'd maintained for 7 years. It wasn't a crisis, but it was complicated. "You've talked to anyone about this?" he asked. "Not yet. I found it this morning." "It could change the water arrangement. You know that." "I know." She folded her hands on the table. "But here's what I want to say before we get into what it changes." She looked at him directly. "I am not interested in leveraging a water rights document against you. Whatever this says legally, I want us to figure out what's fair." He held her gaze. "Grace, if the document's valid, those rights are yours. I'm not going to argue you out of something that belongs to you." "That's not what I'm saying." She leaned forward slightly. "I'm saying I want us to make the decision together, not you deciding what's fair on my behalf, not me deciding what's fair on yours. Together." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You're testing me." Grace's eyebrows lifted just slightly. "I'm doing what—" "Not deliberately," he said, "but this is the same thing. This is the version of the same question you've been asking me since the barn in July." He kept his eyes on hers. "Whether I'm going to decide for you, or whether I'm going to trust you to stand beside me in the decision." She was very still. "Yes," she said. Quiet. "I suppose it is." "Then the answer's the same as it was that day," he said. "Together. All of it." Grace looked at him for a long moment. Something in her face moved, not dramatically, not the way it did in stories. Just a small shift, like a weight she'd been holding, got set down. "All right," she said. "Then let's figure it out." They spread the documents across the table and worked through it for 2 hours. The legal language, the precedent, the practical implications for both properties. By the time the light outside had gone fully gold, and the dinner was long past eating, they had a plan. Not a perfect one. Not one that solved everything. But a fair one worked out between two people who trusted each other enough to disagree twice and land somewhere reasonable. When they finally pushed back from the table, Grace said, "We're going to have to do this a lot." "Work through hard things together," he said. "Yes." "I know." He looked at her across the table. "I'm not afraid of that." "Good." She stood up and started clearing the papers. "Because next month there's the grazing rotation question, and I have opinions about it." "I'd expect nothing less." She almost smiled. He caught it. Outside, the August evening was cooling, and the first stars were beginning to show, and the creek their creek as it turned out in the complicated legal way that things between two people who share a fence line become there ran steady and clear in the last light. Caleb helped her clear the table, and he thought this is what he'd been afraid of. This exact thing, the difficulty and the closeness and the necessity of being honest even when it was inconvenient. This was the thing his father had spent his whole life protecting himself from. And sitting here, papers cleared dinner late, shoulders still slightly sore from the storm, watching Grace stack documents with her careful, methodical hands, he could not for the life of him understand why. The grazing rotation argument happened exactly when Grace said it would. Third week of August, a Tuesday morning, standing at the fence line between their properties with the sun already climbing and both of them holding completely different opinions about which pasture should rest through September. Caleb thought the south section needed the break. The grass was thin. There had been thin since June, and pushing cattle through it another month would set it back for next spring. Grace thought the east section needed it more. She'd been watching the soil around the creek bank, and she didn't like what she saw. Compaction, she said, from 2 seasons of heavy use. Rest it now or pay for it in 3 years. They stood at that fence line for 40 minutes, not yelling. Neither of them were yellers, but firm. Each one making the case, hearing the other not moving. Pete Henley walked past. At one point, looked at both of them, and kept walking with the wisdom of a man who had been around long enough to know when to be somewhere else. Finally, Caleb said, "What if we split it? South section rests September. East section rests October." Grace thought about it. The East needs the full 2 months. "Then we move the rotation start up 2 weeks," he said. "Rest the East from mid-August through mid-October. Move South herd to the North Draw." She looked at him. He looked at her. "The North Draw doesn't have enough water for both herds," she said. "I'll extend the secondary line," he said. "I've been meaning to do it anyway." "That's a week of work." "I know what it is, Grace." She was quiet for a moment. He waited. She had a way of going quiet when she was actually considering something, rather than just pausing, and he'd learned to tell the difference. "All right," she said. "That works." He nodded. She picked up her fence tool and went back to what she'd been doing before the argument started. He stood there for a second watching her, and felt something he hadn't expected: satisfaction. Not the relieved kind that comes from a fight ending. The earned kind. The kind that comes from 2 people disagreeing honestly and finding a third answer that was better than either of their first ones. He went home and started planning the water line extension. The work took 9 days, not 7. 2 of those days he had Grace's help, which made the hard sections faster and the tedious sections bearable. She didn't comment on the fact that it was taking longer than he'd said. She just showed up on day 4 with Pete and a second reel of pipe, and they worked until the light was gone. On the last day, when the line was finished and tested and running clean, she said, "You do good work, Caleb." He looked at her. "You've known that for years." "I have," she said. "But you needed to hear it out loud more than once." She held his gaze. "So I'm going to keep saying it." He didn't have an answer for that. He just looked at her and felt the particular ache of a man realizing how long he'd been starving for a thing he hadn't known he needed. "Thank you," he said, simply. She nodded, picked up her tools. "Wednesday dinner's at my place. Don't forget." "I won't forget." She never had to remind him twice. September arrived, and with it a letter. It came addressed to Caleb at the post office from a land office in Cheyenne, and the return name on it made him stop cold in the middle of the post office floor. Silas Beaumont. He stood there with the envelope in his hand for a moment. Then he walked outside and opened it. It was brief, professional. No personal warmth, but no hostility either. Just the tone of a man who had moved on to other matters and was tidying one last thing. Beaumont wrote that he had completed his land survey of the Ridge Creek area and had decided against any further investment in the valley. He wished the community well. He added in the final paragraph a single personal line: "Morgan, you were right about what you said at your fence that morning. A man who waits for others to step aside on his behalf has already lost. I hope you've stopped waiting." Caleb read that last line twice. Then he folded the letter, put it in his shirt pocket, and rode to Grace's property. She was at the water trough when he arrived, checking the float valve. She looked up at his face. "What happened?" she said immediately. "Nothing bad." He swung down. "Letter from Beaumont." Her expression shifted, careful neutral, giving nothing until she knew what it meant. "What did he say?" Caleb pulled out the letter and handed it to her. She read it. He watched her face while she did. The careful neutrality stayed until the last paragraph, and then something moved behind her eyes, not quite a smile, not quite relief. Something older than both of those. She folded it and handed it back. "He's a decent man," she said. "He is," Caleb agreed. "He just came to the wrong story." She looked at Caleb steadily. "You came to the right one." He took the letter back and held her gaze. I almost didn't. I know. She turned back to the float valve. But you did. That's what counts. He stood there watching her work for a moment. Grace. I want to ask you something. She looked up. He hadn't planned today. Hadn't planned any particular day, actually. But standing here with Beaumont's letter in his pocket, and the September air coming in cool off the ridge, and Grace looking at him with those steady brown eyes that had been seeing him clearly for longer than he'd let himself be seen, it was the right moment. He knew it the way he knew when the weather was about to change. Not from one sign, from all of them together. I want to ask you to marry me, he said. Grace went very still, not surprised exactly, but present in a way that meant the moment had weight. That's not a question, she said. That's a statement. You're right. He held her gaze. Will you marry me, Grace? She looked at him for a long moment. The float valve dripped steadily in the trough. Somewhere behind the barn, one of her horses called out, and another answered. You understand what you're asking, she said. Not as a challenge, as a real question. I do. 2 ranches, 2 sets of problems. Hard years ahead, same as hard years behind. She didn't look away. No guarantees, no certainty. Just work and difficulty, and trying to do right by the land and each other. Yes, he said. That's exactly what I'm asking. And you're not afraid of it? I'm terrified of it, he said honestly. I'm asking anyway. Something broke open in Grace's face. Not dramatically, she was never dramatic. But it was real. The realest thing he'd seen since the night she'd ridden through the storm with a canvas patch kit and found him listing to the left. Yes, she said. I'll marry you, Caleb Morgan. He let out a breath he felt like he'd been holding for 6 years. She stepped forward, and he reached for her hand and held it, and they stood there at the water trough in September and let the moment be exactly what it was, plain and honest, and entirely theirs. I should have asked sooner, he said. Yes, she agreed. You should have. I'm working on being less slow-moving. I've noticed. She squeezed his hand once and let go. Go finish checking that north fence line. You said you'd have it done before October. He laughed. He couldn't help it. Just a short, surprised sound that felt completely natural. Yes, ma'am, he said. They married in October on a Saturday at the small church on the east end of Ridge Creek. Martha Reed stood beside Grace, sharp-eyed and satisfied. Pete Henley stood beside Caleb, steady and quiet, and exactly the kind of witness a man wants when he's doing something that matters. Earl Prentice was in the third pew and cried, which surprised everyone, including Earl. Aunt Helen came from Laramie and behaved herself with impressive restraint, saying only twice that she hoped they'd be comfortable, and only once that she hoped Grace had thought it through. Grace kissed her cheek and told her she had thought it through for approximately 6 years, and Aunt Helen laughed in spite of herself. Thomas Aldridge shook Caleb's hand after the ceremony with both of his and said, "Good man," which from Thomas Aldridge was the equivalent of a lengthy speech from anyone else. Caleb said, "Thank you, Thomas," and meant it. The first winter of their marriage was hard. Not between them, things had the quality of something finally settled into its right shape. But the land was hard. January brought a cold snap that killed 3 of Caleb's calves before he could get them inside, and February brought a week of ice that took down the fence line they'd repaired in August, and sent cattle into Aldridge's pasture again, which at least this time happened to people who knew how to handle it without drama. They handled it together. That was the difference. Not that hard things stopped happening. Hard things never stopped happening on a Wyoming ranch in the 1880s or any other decade. But when the cold snap hit, Grace was already at his barn before sunrise, and when the fence came down in the ice, he was already at her fence line before she'd finished saddling her horse. They didn't discuss it. They didn't have a plan written down. They just knew by that point that when something went wrong, the other one would be coming. It changed something fundamental about how difficult things felt. Martha Reed came by in March, when the worst of the winter was breaking, and found them both at Caleb's kitchen table with the account books open between them, working through the quarter figures. She stood in the doorway and looked at the scene, both of them bent over the same set of numbers, Grace pointing at something, Caleb nodding the coffee pot between them, and she said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "This is what I came to see." Grace looked up. "What?" "This." Martha gestured at the table. "Both of you, working." She smiled not widely, just at the corners. "I'll come back when you're less busy." She left without taking the coffee she'd come for. Chad. Spring brought good grass and a better calf count than the previous 2 years combined. Caleb's north pasture rested through the fall. The way Grace had recommended came back strong. Her east section by the creek recovered the way she'd said it would, the soil looser, the grass fuller, the bank holding clean. She had been right about the rotation. He told her so. "I know," she said, "but thank you for saying it." "You could be less modest about being right," he told her. "I could," she agreed, "but you'd find it insufferable." He smiled. She was correct about that too. The twist that came in May, nobody saw it coming. A letter arrived not from Beaumont this time, but from a land office in Laramie addressed to Grace Morgan. Not Grace Whitaker. Grace Morgan. It still startled her slightly, seeing her name written that way even 6 months in. She opened it at the kitchen table while Caleb was outside. She read it twice. Then she set it down flat on the table and sat very still for a moment. When Caleb came in for midday coffee, he saw her face immediately. "Grace." He was beside her in 3 steps. "What is it?" She pushed the letter toward him without speaking. He read it. The letter was from a surveyor hired by a Laramie investor to assess properties in the Ridge Creek Valley for potential acquisition. The investor was interested in consolidating several small ranches into a larger operation. The surveyor's preliminary report had identified the Morgan-Whitaker property boundary, combined now under the Morgan name, as uniquely positioned. Situated between the primary water source, the best grazing corridor in the valley, and the main cattle road north, the combined property was, in the surveyor's words, the keystone holding of the entire valley. They were being watched. Not approached yet, but assessed. And whoever was doing the assessing understood something that Caleb had failed to see for years, that his property and Grace's separately were 2 modest ranches, barely keeping ahead of the hard years. But together, sitting on that water source, running that grazing rotation, holding that fence line. Together they were something considerably more. Caleb set the letter down. He looked at Grace. "You knew this," he said, "not an accusation, about the combined properties." "I suspected it," she said carefully, "when I found the water rights document. I didn't say anything because—" She stopped, started again. "Because I didn't want you to think I had reasons for this that weren't just what they were." He looked at her steadily. "Did you?" "No." Direct. No waver in it. "I wanted you. I wanted us." The property implications were separate. He held her gaze for a long moment. Then he said, "I know that." She let out a quiet breath. "I know that, Grace," he said again, quieter. "I'm not asking because I doubt you. I'm asking because I want you to hear yourself say it out loud." He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. "Because you never ask for that. You just say what's true and move on. But sometimes it's all right to stand in it for a second." Grace looked at his hand over hers. "I love you," she said, plainly, without ceremony, the way Grace did everything that mattered. "That's what's true." "I know," he said. "I love you too." They sat with that for a moment. Then Grace pulled the letter back toward her. "Now, what do we do about this investor?" Caleb picked up his coffee. "We make clear this property isn't available. And if they make an offer, we decline it. Even a generous one." He looked at her. "Grace, we just spent 2 winters building something here. We just figured out the water rights and the grazing rotation and how to argue about fence lines without ruining each other's mornings." He held her gaze. "I am not selling that to a Laramie investor, so he can fold it into a larger operation and call it progress." Grace looked at him for a moment. "All right," she said. "All right. I just wanted to hear you say it." She folded the letter. "That's the same thing you told me. Sometimes it's good to stand in the answer for a second." He shook his head, but he was almost smiling. "You're going to do that for the rest of our lives," he said. "Use my own words back at me." "Probably," she agreed. "You should think more carefully before you say things." "I'll work on that." "You do that." She stood up and took both coffee cups to the counter and rinsed them out. He watched her. The morning light was in the kitchen, and the spring air was coming through the window, and the account books were on the table, with the quarter figures showing a number that was for the first time in memory comfortably on the right side of the line. He thought about the barn in July, the night in 1879, when she'd come through the sleet, the conversation at the barn door, and at the fence line, and at this kitchen table, the storm and the roof patch and the letter from Beaumont, and the argument about the grazing rotation and the 40 minutes at the fence line that had produced a better answer than either of them had started with. He thought about his father's voice. "Don't reach for what you can't hold." He looked at Grace at the counter, her hands moving completely herself, entirely present. He had reached. He had held. He was holding still. Years later, when people in Ridge Creek talked about the Morgan place, and they did talk about it, because it became the kind of property that drew the eye. Not for its size, but for the particular quality of something that had been built with intention. They said the same thing in different ways. Aldridge said it was good management and smart rotation, and nobody had worked the water rights better in the valley. Earl Prentice said Caleb Morgan was a man who'd figured something out late but gotten it completely right. Martha Reed, who said what she meant without decoration, said, "That's what happens when two stubborn people finally stop protecting themselves and start building something together." Grace heard that one from Martha's own mouth on a September afternoon on Caleb's porch, their porch with coffee in hand, and the late-season grass running green all the way to the ridge. She didn't disagree. Neither did Caleb, sitting beside her in the same chair he'd sat in years ago, looking at numbers that never balanced in a life that had felt too small for wanting anything more. He looked at the land. Now, the fence line solid, the water running clean, the cattle well fed, and counted the barn roof that no longer leaked, and he looked at the woman beside him. And he thought about the question he'd avoided for years. The one about what he was worth. The one he'd tried to answer with account books and acreage and the number of head he ran. He knew the answer now, had known it since the night in the storm, since the kitchen table, since the fence line in September when she'd said yes without a single wasted word. Worth had never been something you counted. It was something you built together one honest day at a time. And Caleb Morgan had finally stopped being afraid of how much of it he had. The letter from the Laramie investors sat on their kitchen table for 3 days, not because they hadn't decided. They had decided the moment Caleb said, "I am not selling that," and Grace had used his own words back at him, and they'd both almost smiled about it. The decision was made. But Grace had set the letter on the table instead of the fire, and neither of them moved it, and Caleb understood why without asking. It was a marker, a before and after line. On one side of it was everything that had almost gone a different direction. On the other side was what they'd built instead. On the third morning, Grace picked it up, walked to the stove and dropped it in. She came back to the table and sat down and picked up her coffee. "Done," she said. "Done." He agreed. That was the end of it. What nobody in Ridge Creek fully understood, not Earl Prentice, not Thomas Aldridge, not even Martha Reed, who understood most things, was how much work the first year actually was. Not the ranch work. That was expected. That was calves and fences and water lines and the kind of physical labor that left both of them tired in the bone by nightfall. That part they both knew how to do, had known for years. The work nobody saw was the other kind. The kind where Caleb woke up at 4 in the morning, with his mind already running the numbers, and Grace had to put her hand flat on his chest and say quietly, and without opening her eyes, "Stop counting, Caleb." And he had to make himself breathe out and let the numbers go. The kind where Grace held something back, a worry about the east pasture, a concern about Pete Henley's knee getting worse, a letter from her aunt that bothered her more than she let on. And Caleb had to notice the exact quality of her silence and ask the right question at the right moment, which he did not always do correctly on the first try. The kind where two people who had both spent years being completely self-sufficient had to learn inch by stubborn inch that being self-sufficient together was a different thing entirely from being self-sufficient alone, and that the difference was not weakness. It was the whole point. They got it wrong sometimes. Not badly, but honestly wrong in the small ways that mattered. A conversation that ended too quickly, a decision made alone that should have been made together, a morning where the distance between them was nobody's fault and both of their faults at the same time. And every time they came back, that was the thing Caleb hadn't expected. Not that they'd be perfect, he'd never believed in perfect, but that the coming back would get easier each time, that the distance would get shorter, that he would stop fearing the moment of repair and start trusting that they were both going to show up for it. That was the thing worth building. He understood it now. June of the second year brought Pete Henley's knee to a full stop. Pete had been favoring it since February, walking with the careful economy of a man redistributing weight he didn't want to admit he couldn't carry the same way anymore. Grace had watched it and said nothing directly because Pete Henley was 64 years old and had more dignity than any three men combined, and the moment you named his limitation out loud was the moment he started carrying it as a burden instead of just a fact. But in June, a morning came when Pete didn't arrive at the barn. Grace found him at his quarters, the small room off the equipment shed, where he'd lived for 11 years, sitting on the edge of his cot, with his boot in his hand, and his jaw set in the particular way of a man in more pain than he was prepared to describe. She sat down next to him without comment. They sat in silence for a moment. "It's time," Pete said finally, not asking, not requesting permission, just saying what was true. "I know," Grace said. "I can still handle lighter work, inventory, the books." "I know that too." Pete looked at his boot. "I don't want charity, Grace." "I'm not offering charity," she said. "I'm offering a different job to a man who's earned the right to have one." She held his gaze when he looked up. "The books need keeping. The inventory's a mess. And frankly, you're better at talking the younger hands through problems than anyone else on this property, and that doesn't require your knee." Pete was quiet for a long moment. "You talked to Caleb about this?" he asked. "No," she said. "But he'll say the same thing when I tell him." Pete looked at her for a moment longer. Then he set his boot down. "All right." When Grace told Caleb that evening, he said, "Of course. He stays as long as he wants to stay." She had known he'd say that. That was still its own small thing, knowing what he'd say. Trusting the shape of him well enough that she could count on it before he spoke. She told him so. He said, "You've known what I'd say since about 1881. You just didn't trust it yet." She thought about that. "That's fair," she said. "We're both getting better," he said. "We are," she agreed. It was Martha Reed who set off the second major crisis of the second year, and she did it completely by accident. She mentioned at the dry goods store on a Wednesday in July to 3 separate people in the span of 20 minutes that the Morgan place was running the best water management in the valley, and that whoever had worked out that rotation system knew what they were doing. By Thursday, 2 neighboring ranchers had ridden to Caleb's gate, not with bad intentions, with questions, genuine ones. How had they handled the east pasture compaction? What was the arrangement on the secondary water line? What had they done differently with the fence line repair after the February ice? Caleb answered them straight, shared what they'd learned, didn't make it complicated. By Friday, there was a third rider. Grace watched this from the kitchen window and came outside when the third man left. "You're giving away everything we figured out," she said. Caleb looked at her. "Is that a problem?" "No," she said slowly. "I'm just noticing it." If the valley runs better, our part of it runs better, he said. Aldridge does well. We don't have to worry about the east line. Heller does well. The water pressure up the creek stays stable. He looked at her. We're not in competition with our neighbor's Grace. We're in a valley together. She held his gaze. Your father would not have said that, she said quietly. No, he agreed. He wouldn't have. She nodded once. Slow. I'm proud of you, she said. Simply. The way she said the things that mattered without decoration, without softening, just straight at him. He felt it land exactly the way she meant it to. Thank you, he said. She went back inside. He stood in the yard for a moment and thought about the fourth rider that would probably come next week, and decided he would answer their questions too. The twist nobody expected came in August. A man named Garrett Cole rode up to the Morgan property on a Tuesday morning with a letter of introduction from a cattle association in Cheyenne, the legitimate kind. The professional organization, not a land acquisition office, and a question nobody had asked them before. He wanted to know if Caleb Morgan would be willing to speak at the fall association meeting about water rights management and grazing rotation practices, not sell his land, not enter a partnership, not discuss acquisition, just speak, share what they'd learned. Caleb read the letter twice. Then he looked up at Garrett Cole, who was a plain-faced, practical man with the earnest expression of someone carrying a request he personally believed in. How many ranchers at this meeting? Caleb asked. 40, give or take. All small operations, mostly, some mid-size, no large investors. Cole paused. It's specifically a small operator summit. That's why your name came up. You've taken a modest property and improved it considerably in 2 years without outside capital. People want to know how. Caleb folded the letter. I'll need to talk to my wife, he said. Cole nodded. Of course. I'll be in town through Thursday. He rode out. Caleb went inside. Grace was at the table with the account books, the same table, except the numbers now sat differently on the page, and both of them knew it. She looked up when he came in, read his face the way she'd learned to read it. What happened? She said. He set the letter in front of her. She read it. He watched her face. She went through the same sequence he had surprised at first, then careful, then something that was not quite pride, but was close to it and warmer. She set the letter down. 40 ranchers, she said. 40. You'd have to talk in front of 40 people about things we figured out by arguing at a fence line for 40 minutes. I'm aware of the irony, he said. She looked at him. Can you do it? He thought about that honestly. Standing up in front of 40 ranchers and talking about water rights and grazing rotation was not something he had ever imagined doing. He was a man who fixed things and kept his head down and showed up quietly and did not typically stand in front of rooms and say words on purpose. I don't know, he said, but I think I should try. Grace looked at him for a long moment. You know what I'm going to say, she said. Tell me anyway. The man who stood in his barn in July of 1884 and told me to go marry someone richer because he couldn't see his own worth. She said, would not have considered this for 1 second. She held his gaze. The man sitting at this table right now is going to say yes. He held her gaze. Yes, he said. She nodded. I'll help you prepare. I know you will. And I'm coming with you, I assumed. And you're not wearing that old jacket. Grace, you are representing this property and everything we've built, and you are not doing it in a jacket that has been patched at the elbow twice. He looked at her. She looked back. Yes, ma'am, he said. The fall meeting was in Cheyenne, 3 days' ride. They left Pete in charge of both properties. Pete, who had rearranged himself into his new role with the dignity of a man who understood that different work was not lesser work, and who managed the inventory and the younger hands and the account cross-checking with the same precision he'd brought to everything else for 11 years. He shook Caleb's hand before they rode out. Said, say what you know. Don't say more than that. It was the best advice Caleb received on the subject. The ride to Cheyenne gave them 3 days of something they rarely had: uninterrupted time. No fence lines to check, no account books, no neighbors with questions. Just the road and the space and each other. On the second evening, camped off the main trail with the fire low and the night coming in cool, Grace said, "Tell me what you're going to say." "Practice run," he said. "Yes." He thought for a moment. Then he started talking. Not formally, just talking the way he talked to her, plain and direct and without the performance of it. About the water rights document and what it had taught them, about understanding what you already had. About the grazing rotation and what 40 minutes of disagreement at a fence line had produced. About the secondary water line and what it meant to extend your resources toward a problem instead of away from a risk. He talked for 20 minutes. Grace sat across the fire and listened completely. When he stopped, she was quiet for a moment. "That's it," she said. That's what you say." She looked at him across the fire. "Exactly that. The way you just told it to me. That's not a speech. That's just what happened. That's why it works," she said. "You're not going to stand up there and tell 40 ranchers something they don't already suspect. You're going to stand up there and confirm what they know is possible because you lived it." She held his gaze. "That's worth more than any formal presentation." He looked at her. "When did you get so smart about this?" he said. "I have always been this smart," she said. "You just couldn't hear me through all the noise you were making, doubting yourself." He laughed. The fire crackled. The night was full of stars. "Grace," he said. I love you." "I know," she said. "I love you too." She pulled her blanket up. "Get some sleep. You've got a speech to give." He gave it on the second day of the meeting, in a room that smelled like coffee and saddle leather, and 40 men who had all spent years doing hard work on uncertain land. He stood up without notes. He said what he'd said to Grace by the fire. The water rights, the fence line argument, the rotation they'd worked out together, the water line extension, what it meant to look at what you had instead of what you lacked. He spoke for 15 minutes. The room was very quiet while he talked. When he finished, the first question came from a rancher in the back row, gray-haired, weathered, the look of a man who had been at this for 30 years and had not expected to learn anything new today. He said, "The rotation system, you worked that out with your wife?" "Yes, sir," Caleb said. "She disagreed with your first approach." "Completely," Caleb said. "And the second approach was better." "Considerably." The rancher nodded slowly. "My wife's been telling me something similar about my east section for 2 years. He paused. "Maybe I ought to listen." Caleb looked at him. "Yes, sir," he said. "You probably ought to." The room laughed. The kind of laugh that was real recognition, not performance. Grace, sitting in the second row, did not smile visibly, but he knew her well enough to see what was in her eyes. They rode home at the end of the week, with the same road they'd come in on the same 3 days, the same fire, and the same sky at night. But something had shifted. Not in their property, not in their situation. In Caleb himself, something that had been tight for so long he'd stopped noticing the pressure of it had finally let go completely. On the last evening outside Ridge Creek, close enough to smell the familiar air of the valley, Grace said, "How do you feel?" He thought about how to answer that honestly. "Like myself," he said. "The whole of it, not the edited version." Grace turned to look at him. "That's what I've been waiting for," she said quietly. "I know," he said. "I'm sorry it took so long." "Don't apologize for the timing," she said. "Just keep being that." He looked at her, at this woman who had seen him clearly before he could see himself, who had crossed no dramatic distances and moved no mountains, but had simply stubbornly refused to accept his smaller version of himself as the final one. "I intend to," he said. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she turned forward, and they rode the last mile into Ridge Creek together, side by side, in the last light of a Wyoming summer evening, coming home to land that was theirs, and a life that was real, and a future that had been built, not given, not inherited, not purchased, but earned honestly, one difficult and worthwhile day at a time. And Caleb Morgan, who had once stood in a barn and told the woman he loved to go find a richer man, finally understood that the richest thing he had ever owned was the courage to stop running from what he deserved, and Grace Whitaker had always known he deserved it.